Hi, and welcome to R&R Living Life. Rick and I begin this episode by following a well-worn road to Finke through some stunning country. Our trip today was to take us firstly to the geographical centre of Australia and then on to Finke before returning to Gidget at Kulgera. The Finke Desert Race had been staged only a couple of weeks prior to our visit, so Rick and I had been expecting the road to be cut up after all the visitors to the desert race, but all in all the road was in pretty good condition, though we still had to watch out for the corrugations, sharp, rough water crossings and rocky patches. About 20 kilometres from Finke, we turned off the road and made our way to the Lambert centre of Australia, a point that marks the geographical centre of mainland Australia with a flagpole. The Lambert Centre is an icon created to commemorate the bicentenary of Australia and is a place named formally gazetted by the Northern Territory Lands Department, with the location of the centre computed using mathematical modelling. The most accurate mapping data available was used in the complex calculations from 24,500 high water marks along Australia's coastline. The modelling provided a latitude and a longitude, with the probability that the geographic centre of Australia lies within 2.5 kilometres of the calculated value, especially given mapping and computer power available in 1988. Erected in September 1988 on Lilla Creek Station, the monument was named in honour of Dr. Bruce Lambert, a former director for the Division of National Mapping, for his achievements in the National Survey, Levelling and Mapping of the Continent. The monument is modelled on a flagpole on Parliament House, Canberra. It is interesting to note that Dr. Cecil Madigan studied Central Australian geology in the 1930s and, using a centre of gravity method by dangling a plumb bob vertically above a metal cutout of Australia, calculated the centre of gravity at a point less than 11 kilometres due west of the present position. What a trek along the 12 kilometres over a very sandy, corrugated and washed out road. There were some of the most exquisite flowers and the beginnings of some interesting ants' nest, not to mention the interesting countryside and sandhills we had to negotiate. If we got over 20 kilometres per hour, the road became very, very rough, but what a trip! There were lots of flies to greet us at the centre and a cool breeze. It really was slow going, as it took us just short of 2 hours to travel there, explore and return to Finke Road. But I would do it again. Our end point today was Apatula, formerly Finke, about 160 kilometres east from Kulgera. The Finke River, one of the oldest river systems in the world, dating back 350 million years, named after German prospector William Finke, is dry most of the year, except during occasional floods, and is part of the Lake Eyre Basin, and meanders within a few kilometres of the community. Apatula is the furthest populated place from the sea in mainland Australia, and the nearest settlement to the geographical centre, the Lambert Centre. Finke was originally established as a railway siding on the original Garn railway line around 1925, beginning as a small working man's camp, where fettlers lived in corrugated buildings without their families. During the war years, the Central Australian Railway was the main transport route for thousands of soldiers from the southern states going to war in the Pacific, and the siding got its first repeater station. In telecommunications, a repeater is an electronic device that receives the signal and retransmits it, so a station operator was needed on site to retransmit the signals. Around the same time, Finke gained its first privately owned business. After World War II, local pastoralists convinced the government to move its cattle yards from Rumbalala to Finke because the water quality at Finke was much better, and the population was thus boosted. After several bridges on the now closed Central Australian Railway were washed away by floods, rails were permanently laid on the riverbed. In February 1953, after 2 days of waiting at Finke Township, the river level was low enough for a steam haul train, the Garn, to proceed slowly across. Then, in 1981, the railway line was relocated 150 kilometres to the west due to floods that washed away huge stretches of the track. With the moving of the track, most non-Aboriginal people left Apatula. The Apatula Housing Company, founded in the 1970s, has played an important part in the economy of the town. Today, the community is accessed by a 434-kilometre road that mostly follows the old Garn rail route through to Alice Springs. In the early days, Apatula had a police force mounted on camels, possibly the largest police patrol in the world, as was it the last police station in the territory to use camels, with the last camel patrol leaving Apatula in 1953. Aboriginal trackers were an essential part of the patrols, finding lost people in the bush. The police were responsible for inspecting stock, registrations of births, deaths and marriages, looking after mines, protecting birds, collecting taxes and law and order, while their wives, again with their many hats, ran the post office, distributed rations while their husbands were away, nursed the sick, and any other task that was required when living in such a remote region. On our return journey to Kulgera and Gidget, we did suffer a flat tyre from a modified 10mm spanner, about 20 kilometres from the Lambert centre turnoff, thanks to the tyre pressure monitoring system that alerted us to the problem. We do expect to have flat tyres from the rough conditions, especially on some of the gravel and sometimes very rocky roads we travel, but this was an unusual way to get a flat. Not something we had expected on the road. Our first flat in over nearly 2 years of travel, so I think we have been lucky. Kulgera started as a cattle station in 1927, selling fuel to passing traffic. I wonder if they were ever paid in mud crabs like we had once been. Anyway, the story goes that the fuel was sent by rail, then picked up by donkey and wagon and stored underground. In 1954, the store was built and later a homestead. Later that afternoon, we wandered around the roadhouse, taking the obligatory photos with the quirky big can, the shoe stand, and admired the items of clothing hanging from the ceiling above the bar. Some of the artwork for sale was impressive, again done by local artists. The old bastard and his dog beside the shed was an interesting addition to the hotel that reminded us of some of the characters we have known while living in rural areas. After a very frosty start, the coldest morning we have had on this trip, we left Kulgera, making our way north to Arlunda Roadhouse at Garn, a small rural location within the local government area of McDonald, where we stopped to stretch our legs and grab a cup of coffee. But the line-up at the counter was unbelievable, so I went without. Rick even had to wait nearly 10 minutes to pay for the fuel. After having thought about it, I was not surprised, as trying to get staff to work in such a remote location would be extremely difficult, and being short-staffed didn't help. The locality Garn was given its name in recognition of the important role the Afghans and their camels played in opening up Central Australia. From Arlunda Roadhouse, we continued making our way north along the Stewart Highway. We crossed the Palmer River and then the Hugh River, with their headwaters in the McDonald Ranges, that both merged with the Finke River, one of the 4 main rivers of the Lake Eyre Basin. But waters rarely reach Lake Eyre. Rather, it often disappears into the sands of the western edge of the Simpson Desert. It infrequently reaches Lake Eyre, only during times of extreme flooding via the Macumber Channel, when it may spread for hundreds of square kilometres beyond its poorly defined banks. The river drains a basin of 115,000 square kilometres, while its 640-kilometre course is studded with permanent waterholes and underground sources. Visited by John McDouall Stuart in 1860, the river was named by him after his patron, William Finke. Just before Stuart's Well we crossed the Hugh River, usually a dry riverbed. Along with Ellery Creek, they are another two of the major tributaries of the Finke River system. There are some places along the Hugh River, like Birthday Waterhole, located in the West MacDonnell Ranges, that retain water. Travelling in this area during rain periods is unadvisable, due to the many low-level water crossings that can quickly become impassable. Not far from Stewart's Well Roadhouse, we stopped at the Cannonball Run Monument that sits on a dusty flat alongside the highway. The monument is historically interesting as it commemorates the two officials and two Japanese drivers who were killed during Day 3 of the Cannonball Run in May 1994, having left Lassiter's Casino in Alice Springs that morning. Where the monument stands is at the location of where the Ferrari F40 crashed at speed, killing the two drivers and two race officials. An inquest identified it was due to excessive speed and driver error. The inaugural Northern Territory Cannonball Run, held over a 3,200-kilometre section of the Stuart Highway between Darwin and Uluru and return, attracted 118 racing enthusiasts from all over the world with their expensive machines. The race contained 3 distinct driving phases within the one event. There was the Flying Mile, a test of a car's acceleration, with cars crossing a starting line at 60 kilometres per hour, and 1,600 metres later their speed was recorded by radar and points awarded accordingly. The second phase was a time section, with stretches of approximately 100 kilometres to which set times were applied, whilst the third section, where there was no competitive element, covered by far the greatest distance, driving at normal everyday driving. What was meant to be an annual event for the Northern Territory became a one-off, and any hopes of some positive publicity had the opposite effect. Further on was the Stewart's Well Roadhouse, a family-owned and operated roadhouse providing a quality service and classic foods to the locals, travellers, visitors and the transport industry. We again stopped for coffee and a sausage roll, but unfortunately they were all out of takeaway food, as a couple of convoys of army trucks had passed through that morning. It was such a welcoming, clean and tidy roadhouse, but we were disappointed that there was no reason to stay longer than to stretch our legs and refuel. On leaving Stewart's Well Roadhouse, we passed through part of the stunning James Range and alongside some spectacular sandstone ridges. About 20 kilometres from Stewart's Well, we passed the turn-off to the Rainbow Valley Conservation Reserve to the east, featuring scenic sandstone bluffs and freestanding cliffs that form part of the James Range. Thought to be around 350 million years old, here was another example of Earth's evolution, where the coloured rock bands in the dramatic sandstone cliffs were caused by water. During wetter times, the red iron of the sandstone layers dissolved and was drawn to the surface during the dry season. The red minerals formed a dark iron-rich surface layer, with the leached white layers below. This dark red capping is hard and weathers slowly, whereas the softer white sandstone below weathers quickly into loose sand. Weathering and erosion have also produced the valley shape, where sandstone blocks have eroded into rock faces and squared towers. The country was forever changing with the West MacDonnell Ranges on the horizon. To the west of the highway was the Owen Springs Reserve, formerly a 1,570 square kilometre cattle station, now a protected reserve since 2003, dissected by the Hugh River with its broad sandy banks lined with shady red river gums. The rocky gorges and red sand country added to the scenic appeal as we drove along the highway. The area protected in Owen Springs Reserve is rich in territory history, with the main access road through the reserve closely following the explorer John McDowell Stuart's route during his early 1860s expeditions through Central Australia. One of the major results from Stuart's explorations was the construction of the overland telegraph line that originally followed his track along the Hugh River through Lawrence Gorge in the Waterhouse Range. Australia's early pastoral history is also featured at the old Owen Springs homestead ruins, which is the site of the first station homestead built in Central Australia, a bucket list item for another trip. The open downs country we were travelling through was covered in feed, like in a lot of places we had travelled through, not only in Western Australia, but also here in the Territory, where they were also having a great season, no doubt leading to the possibility of bushfires later on in the year. The rain seemed to have crossed the continent, giving much needed water to a lot of places. We had been held up crossing the Nullarbor because of it and couldn't venture far off the highway. We had missed a huge storm at Bunbury that had caused considerable damage. Thankfully, we had left the day before, and we seemed to have followed where rain had been in a lot of places, with many of the waterholes full, the table drains full, and the usually dry hollows covered in water. The country was looking healthy and vibrant, with the amount of feed surprising, even through the desert country. I am sure we were seeing the country at its best, after rain. We had even made it across the Great Central before it was closed to rain, but did get held up at Tobermory because of it. Both Rick and I are always glad to see it, as it is such a precious commodity, especially in rural Australia, as those living there depend on those storms so much. Rick and I will leave you for this episode as we arrive in Alice Springs. Join us next time as we explore the Alice, visit Aranet Telegraph Reserve and the Alice Springs Desert Park, pay our respects at Albert Namatjura's and John Flynn's graves, and explore Simpson's Gap. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. Give us a thumbs up if you have. Take care and stay safe. Cheers for now. Rick and Rosemary. R&R Living Life.